I took care of Gannon for the last 2 years in our home because his mother didn't want to do it. And I would never, ever hurt this child.
She said that she would never hurt him. She said those words while refusing to show her face. And as a therapist, wow, when I first saw that footage, I actually had to hit the pause button. I had to sit back for a second because what I was hearing and what I was feeling from her behavior, they were miles apart. It didn't make clinical sense. Genuine trauma doesn't look like this. Today, we're stepping inside the mind of Letecia Stauch. We're going way beyond the headlines and the true crime sensationalism to look at this through a professional clinical lens. Specifically, we're unpacking the defense's massive claim that Letecia suffered from dissociative identity disorder. We're looking at the theory that a broken mind committed this crime, not a calculated person. Which one is it? We're going to find out. This matters because if we get this wrong, if we misdiagnose manipulation as a mental health crisis, we miss how high-level deception actually works. Was this a mind truly fractured by trauma, or was it the most calculated high-stakes performance in trial history? It's a little exaggerated, I know. Understanding the difference isn't just about this case. It's about learning to see the red flags in the world around you. I'm going to show you something later on that a lot of people miss. There's one specific moment in her police interrogation. It was a tiny 3-second linguistic slip that actually tells us everything we need to know about her identities, her alters. It's the moment where the Maria persona and the Letecia persona collided. And the results were, well, they were chilling to say the least. As a licensed professional counselor, when I watch Letecia, I don't just see a defendant on a screen. I see someone navigating what I call a victim mask. It's a psychological shield. I've talked about this in my other videos as well. You may have watched those. But the thing about the mask is that they're heavy and they're hard to keep perfectly in place. We're going to look at the why behind that mask and exactly where it started to slip. I know that's a lot to take in right now, right off the gate, but let's just take a breath just for a second. This case is absolutely heavy. It involves the loss of an 11-year-old boy. And it's easy to get lost in the anger and to see a person and to blame that person. I get it. But here, we're here to understand the why. So let's look at why this clinical distinction actually matters for you and for me in our understanding of human behavior. I'm John Cordray. I've been an LPC or a licensed professional counselor since 2007. I have literally spent thousands of hours in the room with people facing the hardest moments of their lives. One quick reminder here, though, that everything I say in this video is my professional speculation. It's based on public records and behaviors that I'm observing. It's not a formal diagnosis of anyone involved. It's a clinical breakdown for us to learn from. People may look at this case and look at Letecia and just see a cold-hearted killer. As a therapist, when I look at the timeline of her stories, I don't just see a killer. I see a textbook study in cognitive dissonance and possible malingering. Most people focus on the lies. I'm focusing on the fracture. You know, I was looking through the developmental files in this case this morning, and I kept coming back to this one thought. Why DID? Why dissociative identity disorder? Why choose that specific defense here? In the clinical world, DID is incredibly rare. It's born from a level of childhood trauma that most people can't even wrap your heads around. So if she's claiming this, we have to look for that developmental blueprint. Did her mind actually fracture decades ago? Or did she just need a place to hide the guilt? By the end of this analysis, you're going to know the psychological red flags that even the most calculated individuals can't fully hide. And these are skills that you can use to spot deception and incongruent behavior in your own world. Because at the end of the day, the truth has a specific vibe, a clinical consistency. In Letecia's story, it was vibrating on a completely different frequency. We need to start with the interrogation because that's where the victim mask first started to crack under the weight of the evidence. Now, I have to be honest with you guys here. When I first sat down with the transcripts of her 10-hour interrogation, I didn't spend all 10 hours, but I actually had to push my chair back for a second, though. There was a point that was very fascinating to me. It wasn't just the facts of what happened to Gannon, which are horrific and terrible. It was the sheer volume of cognitive dissonance coming off the page. It was heavy. It was like trying to breathe in a room with no oxygen. It sucked the oxygen out of the room. You're reading the words that are meant to sound like a grieving stepmother, but the psychological frequency is just, it's all wrong. It's high-pitched. It's deflective. It's exhausting. As a therapist, I'm trained to listen for the undersong of what a person is saying. And with Letecia, that undersong was a deafening roar of self-preservation. Pull up graphic 3. The verbal claim and the behavioral frequency are miles apart. Contrast her verbal claim, "I would never, ever hurt Gannon. I love him like he's my own son," to the refusal to show her face. Her high-pitched, strained voice and her deflective posture is striking. The undersong of her behavior was a deafening roar of her own self-preservation. It didn't make clinical sense for a grieving stepmother. When the spoken words and the behavioral frequency are this far apart from each other, that's called incongruence. It's the difference between the real self and the ideal self, the self that she was trying to convince everyone around her of. I know I'm starting off a bit intense here. Let's just take a second. It seems like every time I dive into this, it's intense. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by the gravity of this, that's actually a good sign. It means your empathy is intact. So if you need a pause, pause. Need a break? Take a break. But if not, if you want to keep going, let's lean into that as we look at the facts, because the facts are what eventually led to the breakdown of our victim mask. To understand the fracture that the defense talked about, we have to look at the timeline. It started in January 2020. 11-year-old Letecia Stauch goes missing from this home in Colorado. That's horrible for any parent to experience. Now, usually in a missing child case, the primary caregiver is a fountain of information. But with Letecia, that information didn't flow. It morphed. First, it was a simple story. Gannon went to a friend's house and never came home. Then suddenly the story shifted. There was an intruder, and then there was an accident. Every time the investigators found a new piece of evidence, a bloodstain, a neighbor's doorbell camera footage, Letecia's reality didn't break. It just reshaped itself. In psychology, we look at this as a narrative plasticity. Most people, when they tell the truth, their story is like a rock. It's solid. Letecia's story was like water. It just took the shape of whatever container the police put her in. Her story kept shifting when she was confronted with the evidence, the facts. The 3 versions from Gannon went to the friend's house to it was a tragic accident became fluid. It kept moving. Narrative plasticity is when the truth is like a solid rock, but the fabricated narrative is like water. Then her narrative took the shape of whatever the container was presented. Keeping the conflicting lies from colliding is computationally expensive for the brain. It took a lot of sustained effort to keep up with all of her lies. I don't know how she did it. There's no way I could do that. You probably couldn't either. When I look at those early interviews, you know the ones where she's positioned with her back to the camera, I don't just see someone lying. I see someone desperately trying to maintain ego integrity. She couldn't be the person who hurt a child, so she had to be the person who was wronged by the media, wronged by the police, or wronged by an imaginary intruder. But here's the thing about maintaining that many versions of reality. It takes a massive amount of mental energy just to keep those lies from touching each other. And eventually, the system comes crashing down. It's easy to look at this case, to look at what happened to that poor little boy, and just see her as a monster. And I get that. I really do. It's horrible, horrific. The anger is justified. But as a therapist, my job isn't just to label someone as a monster and close the book. If we do that, we don't learn anything. I'm looking for the fracture points. I'm looking for the moment the mind says, I can't handle this reality. I can't handle the truth. Remember that movie with Jack Nicholson? And I think it was Tom Cruise? Yeah, that one. You can't handle the truth. And that brings us to the defense's biggest gamble, the Hail Mary of this entire trial. They didn't just say she was stressed or that she just snapped. They claimed she had dissociative identity disorder. They claimed that Letecia wasn't really there when the crime happened, that a separate identity, a separate alter named Maria took over. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for us. DID, it's a real devastating diagnosis. It's a shield built by a child's mind to survive the unsurvivable. But is that what's really happening here in this trial? In this case with Letecia? Or was Maria just the final, most desperate mask Letecia ever wore? We have to ask, was this a fractured mind or a calculated cover story? Because the answer to that question, it changes everything we think about what we know about this case. Pull up graphic 7. Here's the defense's claim. Letecia's mind was fractured. She wasn't a calculated person who committed the act. She wasn't in her right mind. Instead, the killer was a separate identity named Maria. And it was Maria who took control, committed the act, and then retreated and left Letecia with no memory of what happened. Does that sound plausible? The defense used a very real and a very devastating mental illness and tried to use it as an alibi, as if it was a completely different person. In true DID, the different personalities are called alters, and these alters have different personalities, names, and memories. But this is not what was happening here. We used to call DID multiple personality disorder. Now we call it dissociative identity disorder. I want to take this claim a little further, though. I'm a mental health therapist. What do you expect? And I want to dig into this. We need to understand what true disassociation actually looks like in a clinical setting. We have to look at the developmental blueprint of Letecia's life. Let's pull that graphic next. Genuine DID is the brain's ultimate emergency brake. It's a shield built by a child's mind to survive extreme, prolonged trauma by deciding, this isn't really happening to me. It's actually happening to someone else. It's horrible to think about that a child would have to go through that, isn't it? These identities or alters don't simply pop up when it's convenient for a defense in a murder investigation. Here's another way of looking at DID. It's triggered in early childhood by the extreme and prolonged trauma. Just like I said, This is so hard to imagine happening to a child. And maybe it actually happened to you. I certainly hope not. It's so heartbreaking to even comprehend. During the trauma, a child's mind puts on the brakes as a way to protect themselves. And then the survival mechanism becomes a shield or a dissociative barrier, and the alters form. And now we're getting into the real heart of this trial. And honestly, this part was completely shocking and dramatic for me. The defense didn't just suggest Letecia was unwell, they went all in. This dissociative identity disorder, the multiple personality disorder that we used to call it, it's their argument. It's their total argument of what happened. That's the excuse that they're using. That Letecia didn't really kill Gannon. They claimed that a separate alter, a personality named Maria, took complete control over Letecia and then committed the act and then left. And then Letecia was there with no knowledge of it. I've got to stop here for a second. When I first heard that was the defense's strategy, my clinical spider senses started to kick in, started to tingle. Not because that DID isn't real. It's very real. It's very rare, but it's very real. But because of how it was being used here in the courtroom. They presented Maria as this dark, impulsive force that just surfaced out of nowhere. But as a therapist, I want you to know this. Identities don't just pop up for the first time during middle age, during a murder investigation. There has to be a blueprint. Let's talk about what DID actually is away from the Hollywood movies. In my experience, DID is a survival mechanism. It's the brain's ultimate emergency brake. They slow it down, halt, stop. And it's almost always born from extreme, prolonged trauma in childhood. Imagine a child in a situation where they can't physically escape. Their body is trapped, but their mind is brilliant. And it realizes they can't go somewhere else to survive. Then it creates a wall. And we call that a dissociative barrier. And pushes the trauma behind it. It's the brain's way of saying, this isn't really happening to me right now. It's happening to someone else. And that imprints on their brain. It's, in a way, it's a beautiful but tragic act of self-preservation. It's the only way a child can accept what was happening to them. But, and this is the but that complicates everything with Letecia. For that to be the case here, we would need to see a lifelong history of shattering. We'd expect to see a developmental blueprint of disassociation, starting way back in her childhood. But when I look at her history, I'm looking for those early cracks. And if they aren't there, well, then we have to look at what else might be going on here. All right, hold on just for a second. I got to slow things down again. I know we're talking about DID and how it originates, and it involves children going through horrific times of their lives, and how they use their dissociative wall to help them cope with what was happening to them. I know I'm throwing out a lot of heavy clinical jargon here, but you love that, right? Things like dissociative barriers, alters, trauma responses. It's a lot. And you might be wondering, why does this clinical nuance even matter? Gannon is gone. Why do we need to parse those definitions? Well, it matters because understanding the difference between a defense mechanism and a deceptive manipulation is a fundamental life skill. In your own life, you're going to encounter people who use mental health as a shield to avoid accountability. And knowing how true trauma response looks like versus how a performance looks like helps you protect your own boundaries. It helps you stay grounded in reality when someone else is trying to shift it. So let's keep going, okay? because this next part is the smoking gun of the clinical world. In clinical terms, when we see a sudden onset of symptoms, especially during a crisis, we look for something called secondary gain. Now, bear with me here, because this is where the mask really starts to crumble. It's not always conscious, but the symptom solves the problem. Bring up graphic 11. The concept of secondary gain is the hidden benefit that the patient gets from their symptoms. When the evidence is so crushing and so damaging to the defense, the Maria node was deployed. So the question was, did the Maria alter surface to ensure the psychological survival or to solve a massive legal problem? When a personality only appears to avoid the consequences of an action, it points away from actual trauma and toward a calculated victim mask. In Letecia's case, I have to ask, was Maria appearing because the mind was truly fractured, or was Maria solving that legal problem for the defense and for Letecia? Think about the timing. Did Maria show up when she was safe and processed, or did she only surface when the evidence, like the blood, the GPS data, the shifting stories, became too hot to handle? If a personality only shows up when it's time to avoid the consequences of an action, that's not typically how a clinical disassociation works. When I watched her behavior in the interrogation during the psychiatric evaluations, something didn't quite sit right. Usually when someone has true DID, the alters are distinct, but they don't always serve the main personality's immediate legal needs so perfectly. In clinical terms, malingering isn't a mental illness. It's a behavior. It's an intentional production of a false or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms motivated by external incentives. What were the incentives for Letecia? Well, pretty obvious. Avoiding a life sentence, avoiding the reality of what she had done. When I look at the evaluations from the state experts, they weren't seeing a consistent inconsistency of DID either. They were seeing a calculated inconsistency. For example, Letecia would forget her own name when it was convenient, but then perfectly remember complex details about her defense strategy 2 minutes later. That's not how memory impairment works in a fractured mind. That's how a memory works when it's being used as a weapon. By the time we got to the end of the trial, the victim mask was in tatters. You could see the frustration on her face, not because she was switching, but because the audience, the jury, wasn't buying the performance. And this is the danger of this analysis. When you look past the drama and look at the functional utility of the behavior, the truth usually starts to scream at you. She wasn't a woman who had lost her mind. She was a woman who had lost control of the narrative. She didn't like that. And for a manipulator, losing the narrative is the ultimate defeat. We've seen the why and we've seen the how. But what does this mean for us, for you and for me? How do we take this horrific case and turn it into something that we can use to understand the people in our own lives? Let's move to the clinical takeaway here, because there is a macro lesson about the human nature that we all need to hear. I spent a lot of time looking at the clinical file of this very dark case. It's very dark, isn't it? But I want to pivot away from the courtroom and talk about us, because there is a takeaway here. It isn't just about a trial in Colorado. It's about the fundamental truth of the human condition. And as humans, we have this incredible and sometimes dangerous ability to create narratives. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of our pain, of our failures, and our choices. Usually, this is a healthy thing. It's how we survive grief and move past a mistake. But Letecia Stauch represents the absolute tragic criminal extreme of that process. She didn't just tell a story. She really tried to build an entirely different reality to avoid the excruciating pain of her own actions. She tried to hide from herself. And when you try to hide from the truth of who you are and what you've done, you don't just lose the truth. You lose your humanity. It's a terrifying reminder that while the mind can be a shield, it can also become a prison if we use it to lock out accountability. I was actually just thinking about a client I had years ago, not a criminal case, just someone struggling with a difficult divorce. And they were doing the same thing, though. They were creating this alternate version of events where they were the perpetual victim, even when the facts said otherwise. It's a spectrum. And we all have that victim mask in our closet, don't we? We all want to reach for it when we feel cornered or ashamed. But the difference, the terrifying difference, is that most of us have a reality testing center in our brains that says, wait, that's not true. I have to own this. I have to own my accountability. But Letecia's story is what happens when that center is completely bypassed by the ego. It's so tragic about what happens when we value our image more than our integrity. Whew. We've covered a lot of ground here in this case. And honestly, it was pretty dark, wasn't it? Why do we do this? Why do I talk about this? Why do I do these clinical breakdowns? Why do I analyze cases like this? Why do you watch videos like this? It's not just for the true crime factor, although that's a big part of it. It's because by looking at the extremes, we can learn how to navigate the middle. We learn how to protect ourselves by recognizing these clinical red flags, the incongruent emotions, the high-pitched defensiveness, the shifting identities that suddenly appear the moment someone is cornered. You become better at protecting your own peace in your own world. This is the stakes reality. It's high stakes. Think about the people in your life right now, the ones you work with, the ones that are in your family and in your social friendships. Have you ever felt that psychological frequency that just felt a little off? Like you were talking to a mask rather than a person? Understanding the concepts of malingering, secondary gain, and narrative plasticity, it gives you a language for that feeling. It validates your intuition. When you see someone consistently using their struggle or their mental state as a shield to avoid taking responsibility for how they treat you, that's a massive red flag that you can't afford to ignore. My goal for you in this channel is to help you sharpen that behavioral radar so you can spot the Letecias of the world before they have a chance to fracture and penetrate your reality. I want to help you spot the red flags before it's too late. When you're ever questioning yourself about a high conflict individual in your life, look for that incongruent emotion, the sudden shifts of excuses, and that shield of struggle attempting to bypass accountability. At the end of the day, the Letecia Stauch case is a mirror. It forces us to ask, what other stories I tell myself? Where am I avoiding accountability? Now, hopefully for 99.9% of us anyway, our avoidance doesn't lead to violence. But the psychological mechanism is the exact same thing. They're identical. Integrity is the only cure for disassociation. When we own our truth, even the parts that are ugly, even the parts that hurt, we stay whole. We stay integrated. Letecia chose to shatter, and in doing so, she destroyed more lives than just her own. She left a trail of wreckage that can never be fully repaired. If you're up for it, I've got another video on the psychology of deception right here that I think you should watch. Do you think a person can truly lose themselves in their own trauma or their own stories to the point where they literally don't know right from wrong? Or is accountability, the act of being responsible for our own choices, the only thing that truly matters in the end? Is there a point where illness stops and choice begins? That's something to think about.